9 p.m.
9 p.m. Okay, so it's good morning to you.
Good morning.
We seem to have a time lag. We seem to have a moment when I'm speaking, you hear me, and then you hear me after a moment. Is that right?
That could be, yeah.
Okay, all right. So we'll get used to it.
Great. So thanks for taking the time to have an interview with us today. And before we begin, I'd like to ask if it's okay if we record this interview.
Sure, please do. No problem.
Thank you. So I'm Emily, a member of UBI Taiwan, and I'll be in charge of the interview today alongside with Tyler, founder of UBI Taiwan. And we also have a few other members helping out who are online right now.
Good. Okay, good.
Great.
Welcome to be here. Pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. So today, this interview is mainly to raise awareness. We're going to produce this into a podcast, and we really hope to raise awareness of basic income in Taiwan and introduce this topic to the general public who may not know about UBI. So we'll be covering some basic questions and gradually go deeper.
Okay, fine, no problem.
And we hope that the podcast will sort of surround the topic of making universal basic income a reality during the COVID-19 crisis. So we'll talk a little bit about the pandemic and also how we can promote UBI during this time.
Okay.
Great. So let's begin. Thank you so much. And could you define universal basic income for us and briefly explain your core beliefs with UBI?
Okay, first of all, I would like to say that the term I have always used is basic income, not universal basic income, okay? And I feel uncomfortable with the term UBI as such. I prefer basic income. And the reason is that for practical political reasons, one would have to have limitations on who would be entitled to the basic income. In other words, it couldn't be totally universal. If you were operating a basic income system in Taiwan, you would have to have some rule to exclude temporary migrants, illegal migrants, and people who have Taiwan citizenship but live outside Taiwan. You would have to say that none of those groups would be entitled to the basic income. In an ideal world, then you would want everybody. But in practical political terms, to make it politically attractive, we would have to have limitations on entitlement. So I prefer the term basic income. When I was young and first proposing basic income, I used the term social dividend. And a social dividend is a return on the collective public wealth of the country. Okay, I'll come back to that later. But the term basic income captures the essential idea. And the essential idea is that every legal resident of Taiwan or of any other country would have the economic right to receive each month a modest, moderate, small amount in cash or cash equivalent form as a right individually, not on a household basis, but each woman, each man would have an equal right, an equal basic income. Very important aspect. And it would be paid without conditions. In other words, you wouldn't have to prove that you had done this or that or something else before, and you wouldn't have to do things like search for a job or show that you're married or certain age or something like that. It would be a right of being a legal resident of Taiwan. That is the essence of the idea. Now, the justification is fundamentally ethical. And when I mean ethical, I mean moral. If you think that the wealth and income of every one of us, you and me included, is far more to do with the efforts, achievements, contributions of many, many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. The wealth of all of us is produced by our ancestors going back many, many generations. And if we allow for the private inheritance of private wealth, as all governments do, then we should also allow for the social inheritance of the social wealth, and that each of us equally should have an equal social dividend, a common dividend. Because we don't know if your ancestors or my ancestors contributed more or less to our collective wealth. So it would be ridiculous to try and say that one person should have more than other people. So that is fundamentally a common justice principle. But it's also a justification to say that a basic income would enhance freedom. It would give people a sense of greater freedom, a freedom from potential domination by figures in authority who can exert pressure over us. The fact is that if you have basic income security, you will have more freedom than if you don't have a basic income security. And this is very, very important for women, because women in general have been in subordinated patriarchal relationships. And what we have found with pilots, with basic income experiments around the world, is that when women have a basic income, many of them can escape oppressive, exploitative relationships and have walked out of abusive relationships. And that is indicative that you need to have financial security in order to be free, in order to say no to exploitation and oppression. And the third ethical reason is that basic income gives security, basic security, not total security, basic security. The security which is a human need. We all need basic security. And if you don't have basic security, your mental IQ diminishes. Your capacity to be rational, to be a long-term strategic thinker, building your life, dealing with other people, is diminished. And therefore, basic income provides basic security. That's very important principle. But now we have the pandemic. We have the situation where a basic income is ethically desirable for the reasons I have just given. But now we have a situation where the pandemic is causing incredible vulnerability, incredible loss of resilience, individual resilience, family resilience, and societal resilience. And we have one key lesson to learn. And that key lesson is that if some groups in our society remain insecure and vulnerable, all of us will remain vulnerable and insecure, subject to having an attack of a pandemic to come. The strength and resilience of society will depend on everybody having resilience, having basic security. Because if some groups are vulnerable, they will have rising social illnesses. They will remain susceptible to having an attack of either this virus or some future virus or some social illnesses that come from some other source. And I think one of the key lessons that people are learning around the world, is that we need a new income distribution system which gives everybody basic income security. I've just seen an opinion poll in the whole of the European Union, and over 70% of the people now are in favor of a basic income. One of the lessons that we're all learning from this pandemic. And I, as someone who's promoted basic income for over 30 years and helped to build Basic Income Earth Network, I am feeling quietly confident that we are going to have a surge of support, particularly among the young, particularly among the educated, who can look to the future and want an ecological future and want to have a society of solidarity. These people are now saying, yes, a basic income would help. It's not an answer to every problem. It's not a panacea, but it is a key element in a progressive vision of a good society.
So would you say that basic income has become a more dominant trend or generated a lot more discussion in mainstream media due to the pandemic right now?
Without a doubt, the pandemic has led to millions and millions of people coming out in support. It's led to billionaires supporting, it's led to very poor people supporting, it's led to people of different groups in society, men, women, children. People can understand that we need a basic income. I was giving a talk on basic income the other day to an international audience, and I was saying that the case for a basic income is moral, is ethical, and an hour after I gave the speech, I received an email from a 15-year-old girl. And the 15-year-old girl said she'd been listening and she'd been now studying, and she wanted to say how it made complete sense to her. And she wanted to ask me what she could do to help advance the campaign for a basic income. I was so happy to receive that email because there it was, a young teenager who had the intelligence and empathy to understand that a good society is when everybody has basic security, when everybody does not fear when they go to bed, if they have a bed at night, waking up and not having enough to have their food for the next day, or be able to keep buying the basics that make a life dignified. We need a system and a society where we want everybody what we want ourselves. We want for ourselves to be assured, to be secure, to have the confidence that we and our family, our children or our parents have enough on which to survive. And we want that for other people. And as I say, it takes courage for us to want for others what we want for ourselves. And I think that the understanding of basic income in a crisis like we have today is very much influenced by that human instinct that that girl represented, and that was beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing that example. I think we've all observed also in Taiwan that there are many more young supporters of basic income nowadays. And so, speaking of the pandemic, could you share or comment on perhaps the relief programs that we've seen across European countries right now?
I think the responses of governments in Europe and in the United States in particular have been pretty bad. They have been an attempt in essentials to restore the status quo ante. In other words, restore yesterday before the pandemic. They've been an attempt to prop up the banks. They've been an attempt to stimulate share prices. They've been an attempt to preserve old jobs and give those in positions of strength a return to that position of strength. But in the process, the Precariat, the group that I've written most about over the last 20 years, the Precariat, the people living with insecure incomes, with insecure, unstable jobs, living on the edge of unsustainable debt, feeling stressed, suffering depression and suicidal tendencies, this group, the Precariat, have been quietly left out of the recovery programs. They have not received the wage subsidies. They have not had their jobs guaranteed. They have not been helped with their debts. And as a result, we are seeing huge increases in unemployment, huge increases in homelessness, covered up statistically because they're being pushed into hostels, but they're still homeless, really. We're seeing people queuing for food banks, soup kitchens, and things like that, relying on charity. And I think it is one of the indictments of the model of rentier capitalism that existed before the pandemic, that we have a huge charity state. Charity relies on individual philanthropy, generosities, and it relies on every individual to give money or food or clothes or something. But it undermines society. It undermines social solidarity, because charity is a matter of pity. We pity people in those circumstances. And pity is akin to contempt. There's no respect there. There's no solidarity. It shames the giver as well as the recipient. And I think that a charity state is a loss of society. It's a loss of solidarity and community, and it lacks dignity for all of us. So for me, what I've seen is a growth of subsidies to the upper income groups, propping up finance, propping up big corporations, and the Precariat grows. And I've seen a reliance on charity. So we see a growth of inequality. And at the moment, there is nothing to suggest that those governments are understanding we need major structural changes, or we're going to have more pandemics, more shocks, more situations of social illnesses, more morbidity, more cancers, more of the sense of social illnesses where people feel suicidal and so depressed and stressed that it induces other illnesses. So for me, at the moment, while a lot of money is being spent, a lot of money, you could have a very good basic income system with the money that's being spent, but it's being spent in wrong ways to try to restore yesterday, not build a new society. And therefore, I think one has to say that this is an opportunity that exists, but an opportunity at the moment that has not been taken.
Yes, and I think this sort of circles back to your point on how the basic income can build resilience among the society and how it's going to help us overcome future crises like these.
I want to circle
Yeah,
to.
I'm glad.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I'm extremely glad that you've come back to that, because for me, I think the key word here, the word that we should be using as a banner, is resilience. Resilience means that an individual or a society has the capacity to respond to a shock without going into deeper crises. Resilience means that we can cope with a challenge and we can respond and we can recover. At the moment, millions of people in every society do not have resilience. It's not their fault. It's the fault of the economic system that leads people to be in the precariat and to have to suffer economic insecurity, chronic levels of debt, and a feeling that they're not going anywhere, a feeling that they're not developing themselves in the way they live. And resilience is something that any good society needs. And it relates to the threat of extinction, the ecological crisis. Because the ecological crisis is basically about the lack of resilience in nature as well. I think we've established that the pandemic is due to a large extent to the disruption of humans' interaction with nature, so that the animal species that have these viruses are being pushed more and more into human societies, human domains, where suddenly we become susceptible to contracting these new viruses. It's not a unique event, this pandemic, coronavirus. There will be future equivalents of the coronavirus, and we need to be more prepared. We need to be more concerned with our relationships with nature. And we need to have an economic system which says that everybody can have enough without the plutocrats taking all of the income or most of the income. This has been a theme of my books, that if we have a situation where the plutocrats are taking most of the rentier income, that leaves less and less income for the precariat. And therefore, in order for the precariat to have a rising living standard, you have to have higher and higher economic growth. But higher and higher economic growth means more and more global warming, more and more distortions of our relationships with nature, more and more resource depleting labor instead of the work that most of us would love to do. The work of living in our communities, volunteering, caring for our loved ones, much of which is not compensated through the wage labor market. We need to rethink how we live. And I think this pandemic crisis is giving an opportunity, again, particularly for the young, particularly for the young in the precariat who are educated and they understand the concept of being in the precariat. They have an opportunity to present a politics of paradise, is what I've called it, a politics of paradise, in which basic income is only one element, but is an important fundamental element. And that, I think, is the key message that I've been trying to convey through my books and talks.
I want to delve a little bit deeper into the coronavirus and give a little bit about Taiwan's context. The big political fight here was number one over cash versus vouchers. They wanted to force people to have to spend the money. And they also wanted to control what types of businesses you were able to spend it at. That's number one. And number two, for cash that was available, they made the criteria for applications incredibly strict because they wanted to make sure that they could maximize the amount by giving it only to those that they believed need it. And they also were targeting particular groups like taxi drivers and those types of groups. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the global trends. Do you generally see more of a trend towards unconditional type of aid and cash being doled out in the general trends for the coronavirus response? Or is there also a lot of this reaction like we had in Taiwan, where it's kind of going back to traditional types of welfare and controlling the way that people use their relief?
Well, Tyler, you've got a lot of points there in your questions. Let me start by saying I'm strongly against vouchers. The first and fundamental reason that I'm against vouchers is it's paternalistic. It means that the bureaucrats, the politicians, think they know what you and everybody else wants and needs. We know best, says the bureaucrat. And that is very paternalistic. It is very directive. And it obviously, by definition, restricts freedom. It is an attack on freedom. I don't know what you need most. I don't know whether what I think you need is either good or bad, okay? And I don't think it's sensible for any government to restrict the freedom of people to decide for themselves what they think they need. Sometimes people make bad choices. Sometimes they spend it in bad ways, but so do bureaucrats. The second reason I'm against it is it's enormously expensive from an administrative point of view, enormously. If you operate a system of vouchers and you say you can only buy certain things, then they have to have checks, that they have to have all the systems in place. And then you say, well, who's allowed to supply those goods? Only selected people and corporations and things, favored groups. It becomes a very easy way to go into corruption. But then, of course, there's the poverty trap situation. These schemes, whether you give it to a taxi driver or you give it to people who are measured as poor, you have to have tests to see who qualifies, all right? So you say only to taxi drivers. Well, supposing a person is a taxi driver for 2 days a week and a farmer for 3 days a week and a housewife for 2 days a week. I mean, what becomes the definition of a taxi driver? It becomes stupid. It becomes arbitrary. And why figure out why only taxi drivers? What about the care worker? What about the street cleaner? What about the nurse? What about all the people who are doing what they call essential services, often in dangerous circumstances? It makes no sense. It is arbitrary. It is politically motivated. And it doesn't stand up to a moment's ethical scrutiny, okay? But then if you say we only give the income support to the poor, the designated poor, all right? Well, you immediately have the poverty trap situation. First of all, you have to identify who is poor. And in a pandemic situation, people will be fluctuating. 1 week they will have income that's above poverty line, and the next week they may have an income that's below poverty line. If you measure their income 1 week, you'll say no, they don't qualify. You measure it another week, yes, you do qualify. It would be an administrative nightmare. and you had high exclusion errors. You'd have a whole lot of people who would not receive any support because they were tested at the wrong time, or they were stigmatized, or they were too frightened to deal with the bureaucracy. But then you have the poverty trap. Because if you say only the poor should receive the income support, if that person makes an effort to take a low-wage job or to try and improve his or her income by working some more on something, they will lose the benefit. That means they will effectively face a marginal tax rate. And this has been measured in many, many countries. It's not me speaking, it's a fact. They will face a marginal tax rate of 80% or more. In other words, they will only get an extra 20% because they will lose those benefits. And therefore, the wage is only extra amount. And when you take the costs of commuting and costs of other going to work costs, they will not get any extra for working 40 hours a week. So there's a huge poverty trap discouraging people from doing what they would otherwise like to do. This is mad. This is mad. And therefore, I think it's much better to give every legal resident of Taiwan a basic income and say we are going to modify the tax rates at the higher end so that the rich don't get an extra amount, so you don't run into the problem of why give to the rich, because you have it and you tax back if you wish. That's a political decision. But it's much better to do it that way than to try to identify who is the poor and only give it to the poor. It's a crazy system.
Can you comment on Spain specifically, because the headline was that Spain is becoming Europe's first basic income. So I'm curious your perception.
Well, I have been writing in Spanish newspapers for the past few months. They asked me last year to write a regular column for the leading Spanish newspaper, El País. And I've been writing about the need for a basic income in the pandemic circumstances. And the coalition have introduced a scheme which is called Ingreso Minimum Vital, which is literally a vital minimum income scheme. And I've written an article saying this is a shame because it's a missed opportunity. It is not anything like a basic income. It's the opposite of a basic income, even though a number of commentators have claimed that it's a basic income. What it does is it says that they will give an income support benefit to those households that had a poverty level income last year, 2019, i.e. before the pandemic struck. Now, of course, the number of people who've been pushed into poverty since the pandemic struck is much greater than the number of households that had below the poverty line last year. It's estimated that in Spain, at the moment, something like 12 million people are in absolute poverty as a result of previous circumstances and the pandemic. At the most, with being very, very optimistic, this scheme will reach 1 million. The majority of people who are in income insecurity and in poverty. I think it's a scheme which has failed to reach the most vulnerable groups in Spanish society. And therefore, Spain will have precisely what I was talking about earlier, that it will be vulnerable to a second wave of the pandemic later this year, as winter comes to Europe in October, November, December. They have progress in curbing the numbers of people being infected and the number of people dying. It's gone down a lot, but at a huge social cost and economic cost of the lockdown. And the danger must be, unless you reach all those who are economically insecure and give them the means of resilience, then the society and the individuals are going to be very fragile later in the year. And that, I think, is a warning that the policymakers must understand.
So currently in Taiwan, us UBI Taiwan has been trying very hard to promote the idea of basic income, of course, and also how it really helps with security and resilience during the pandemic. However, the situation in Taiwan is that we're a relatively more conservative and pragmatic society. And there is this saying that basic income is sort of reaping without sowing, or equivalent of a free lunch, sort of like a Chinese proverb. And a lot of people don't really buy into this concept because they think that you're receiving free stuff without working hard. So could you give a comment, or how would you promote basic income when facing a more conservative group of people?
I would say the first thing I would say is that anybody who makes that argument must logically, if they're being honest, also state that they want to abolish all private inherited wealth. Mm-hmm. Because private inherited wealth is something for nothing for a few, for a minority. They've done nothing to deserve that. So I want people who say that this giving something for nothing through a basic income, I want them to speak up and say loudly and clearly that they want to abolish private inherited wealth, because otherwise they're being hypocritical. Second, I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that you can interpret a basic income as a social dividend, a social inheritance from our forefathers and foremothers who've contributed to the wealth of society, so that we all have a share. The third argument I would make against that theme is this. Even a right-wing economist like Milton Friedman understood that for a proper market economy to function, every individual must have basic security in order to be rational and in order to be able to make good choices. And we also know from the psychologists, and I've summarized this in my new book, Battling 8 Giants, we also know that people who are insecure, fundamentally insecure, have a suffering of loss of IQ, a loss of mental bandwidth, a loss of the ability to be in control of their emotions, in control of their decision making. And I think that means that it is unfair of us to expect people who are chronically insecure to be able to function well. It's not fair. It's not fair. Because if you or I were in those circumstances, we too would suffer a loss of IQ and mental capacity. The evidence is overwhelming. And the last point is I would go back to something I quote quite often, which is a saying by Confucius. And Confucius said, the easiest way out is through the door. Why do so few people not use that route? If we want a good society, we should mean everybody should be sharing in it, and everybody can have full responsibility as citizens. The easiest way out is through the door. Everybody with basic income from which they can build their lives, build the lives of their children, build the lives of their community, and be held responsible as citizens. And for me, the answer goes back to an ethical foundation, that we should challenge those very people who are really talking about defending their own privileges and the privileges of theirs and their friends, and say, no, no, no. You want a good society? Then we need everybody to have what you want, to have what you've got. And that is basic security.
I want to talk just briefly, because I know we're about out of time, what our current process is, and then get your kind of final point of view on where we should go next. So as the pandemic was entering its kind of global stage, we started working on a emergency basic income white paper, which we actually worked with two of the political parties in the legislative yuan here in Taiwan to introduce the white paper. And they saw it as kind of a springboard for discussing UBI broadly. So I thought that was a very hopeful situation. The problem that we ran into was that we're really the only NGO that's talking about this. It's not like Europe, where there's a lot of NGOs that are kind of working together. It's in Taiwan, it's really just us, and we've garnered a bit of influence, and we've met some folks. But I'm curious, from your perspective, when we're working with these legislators who are asking us what steps we can take to make sure that if they propose this idea that they're not taking a large political risk, what steps should we take as an organization to help us when we're working with legislators?
Well, I think you've touched there on the really significant issue of the moment, because I think the arguments in favor of basic income are very strong. The intellectual base that we've established is very strong. And yet the politicians seem to have what I call spaghetti backbone. In other words, their backbones are not very strong. You know, they don't. Quite often you will get them in private and they'll say, yes, I support basic income, Guy, but I don't know how to come out because it's too risky. And they don't have courage. Most politicians don't lead, they follow. And that point is that we need to mobilize ourselves. We need to mobilize, extend the arguments through the Precariat. The Precariat in Taiwan is very big. I get a lot of people contacting me about the Precariat, as in China, as in Hong Kong. It's a global phenomenon. Those people in the Precariat, particularly the young educated, they get it. They understand it. And I really think that our strategy must be to mobilize and energize the Precariat. Okay? I think at the same time, we have to explore new ways of building that support base. Things like Zooms now are becoming a powerful mechanism for doing just that. I mean, I think I've probably done 40 or something already in this lockdown, plus lots and lots of media interviews. It is an opportunity where people are wanting to engage, okay? And I think that we need to reach out to the politicians and say, look, the very least you can do is say, look, we do need to make sure that every group in society has resilience. Do you understand that? Do you understand that? Say to them, do you understand that? If some groups in Taiwan are left unresilient, all of Taiwan will be unresilient. And hammer that message. We will only have resilience if everybody is resilient. This is the nature of a pandemic. This is precisely the lesson that we should be learning and using to identify what sort of policies. It's no use supporting the top 50%, the top 70%, if the bottom 30% is left insecure, and they will get the illness, they will get the social illnesses, they will get the suicidal tendencies, etc. So we have to hammer this away to the politicians. I understand your predicament. You are in a conservative environment, a family-oriented, traditional Confucian type of background, if you like, where Chinese moralities are something to respect and something that provides barriers to change. You have to find the language to reach through that. To say, yes, if we want to preserve a Chinese type solidarity that respects ancestors, respects cultures, respects identity, then we have to have the mechanisms to enable people to comply with the ethics of that framework. And I think it's a challenge not just in Taiwan, it's a challenge in every society to combine this appeal for something new with a link to the past, a link to our traditionals. Before the lockdown, I had the privilege of speaking the opening speech at the foundation of the Kenyan Basic Income Network in Kisumu, in Kenya. And in East Africa, they have a traditional value called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a question of solidarity, that when you go to a community that's built with reciprocities, it says that if you give, you expect to get back. And you must give because it helps preserve and build on community values that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And you need to relate the appeal of basic income to the preservation and strengthening of Ubuntu in East Africa. When I said that in this big inaugural meeting, everybody clapped because they understood. They understood better than me the meaning of Ubuntu and the meaning of linking the past with community and the future and wanting to preserve it, wanting to strengthen it in a time when all systems of solidarity and community are under threat. Anytime there's a plague, a pandemic, community is under threat. And I think that your challenge is to find the right combination of new language with old language and concepts to appeal. And in that regard, I think that you could reach out to the UNDP, which is now in Bangkok, which is in favor of basic income now, and various other NGOs. And of course, link up with Bien and Sarath Devala and others who are promoting a similar perspective here in India and elsewhere, where we continue to build, because I genuinely believe that we have an energy, we have a spirit, and we have something that people can respect. They may have difficulty agreeing with us, but increasingly they respect what we're trying to say. They are listening. They are listening. And that, I can tell you from working on this issue for 40 years or whatever, is something we didn't used to have. And therefore it was difficult. But today, that particular challenge is not so strong. We have people listening. We have people who are eclectic and wanting to be convinced. Okay, wanting to be convinced. They are not hostile. They're not cynical. There are those, of course. There are those. But there are many more people who are now open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to use that point to work hard and not be dispirited by feeling lonely, feeling isolated, and feeling defeated, because we're not. We have a chance, it's a 50% chance perhaps, that we will see real progress in the next year or so. And that, I think, is where we have to say to ourselves, we have no excuse to be passive, cynical, or defeated. We're not.
Yes, I think I definitely agree. And the last question we have today is one more quick question is that do you think it's necessary now in this situation that pilot experiments are necessary to promote basic income?
Well, as you probably know, I've been a long time advocate of basic income pilots. Okay, some people in Bien are hostile to pilots, including the current chair, and some people think that they're not necessary. Strictly speaking, they're not necessary, because we have strong philosophical arguments for a basic income. But I do strongly believe that pilots are a way of legitimizing basic income system. They are very good ways of dealing with what I call low-hanging fruit. The objections that are easy to make, easy to deal with. These are like, if you had a basic income system, people would become lazy.